In that neighborhood school, surrounded by busy streets and a routine that repeated itself day after day, two worlds coexisted silently under the same roof. The runners witnessed daily stories that never intersected. Despite sharing the same space, Amanda paraded around as if she owned the place. It was impossible not to notice his presence. His perfectly arranged hair, his always impeccable shoes, his designer backpacks, and his haughty look that did not make a point of hiding the contempt he felt for everything he considered inferior. The daughter of an influential politician, Amanda grew up surrounded by luxury and privilege. She had a private driver, lived in a mansion with a swimming pool, and at school treated everyone as if they were below her. Nothing seemed to touch her, as if the world were a stage and she was the absolute protagonist. At the other end of reality, Mary walked, a discreet girl with a sweet look and serene manner, who occupied the same rooms and the same courtyards, but as if she were in a parallel universe. His mother, a tireless warrior, supported the house with effort, preparing lunchboxes every day to sell on the streets. It was from this simple income that the livelihood of the two came. Maria carried a crumpled lunchbox, well-groomed clothes, although already worn, and a notebook full of notes and dreams. He had no influential friends, nor was he the center of attention. But even so, he never stopped smiling. She was grateful for the little she had, and was not ashamed of it. His gaze was full of light, as if hope lived there, firm, even in the face of so many difficulties. Although they were at the same school, Amanda and Maria rarely really met. They crossed paths in corridors, shared the dining hall, sat in close rooms, but their worlds remained far apart, like two planets rotating in different orbits. Amanda didn't notice Maria, and if he noticed, he made a point of ignoring it. For her, that girl with the old lunchbox and unmarked backpack was not even worthy of attention. Meanwhile, Maria remained firm, facing the days with courage, carrying on her shoulders a maturity that time imposed on her too soon. The school itself was a reflection of the society around it, a mix of contrasting realities, where some students arrived in armored cars and others on foot, with their shoes punctured. In the classrooms, the teacher tried to level the knowledge, but outside of there, the differences were evident in every detail. In the school materials, in the clothes, in the conversations, in the playground. Amanda was surrounded by classmates who followed her like satellites. Everything he said was listened to attentively, even when he used harsh words to belittle others. She had learned to measure her worth by what she owned. He grew up hearing compliments about his family status, expensive dinners, trips abroad. And now, he repeated all this as if it were armor. She was admired by some, feared by others, and untouchable by many. Maria, on the other hand, lived in the opposite direction of the scenario. He entered and left the school almost unnoticed, with the light steps of someone who did not want to bother. Always helpful, respectful, she got good grades and showed more interest in her studies than in the spotlight. In breaks, she would sit in a corner to eat her simple snack, often a loaf of bread and egg, carefully wrapped by her mother. He never complained. He was never ashamed. I knew that food was a result of a lot of effort. Even without status, he carried a nobility invisible to the eyes of those who only saw appearance. The school was, for Maria, a refuge for learning, and for Amanda, a stage where she reaffirmed her superiority. The coexistence between these very different worlds seemed to continue without major interference. However, fate, with its silent and unpredictable way of sewing the threads of life, prepared something that would forever change the history of the two. It was only a matter of time before the paths inevitably met, and when that happened, neither of the two worlds would come out unscathed. But while that moment did not arrive, each one went at their own pace. Amanda continued to be the reference of power and status among her colleagues, without imagining that her reality, so stable in appearance, was about to crumble. And Maria, even in silence, continued to grow inside, accumulating strength and character, things that do not fit in shop windows or buy with money. The school followed its course. The days passed, and the runners continued to witness the silent dance between these two universes. Everything seemed the same until a gesture, an attitude, would come to change everything. If you like exciting stories full of twists and turns, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters of this true and inspiring story. The sun shone brightly that morning, warming the schoolyard where students spread out in small groups. It was more of an ordinary playground, with mixed voices, loud laughter, and the usual noise of footsteps running from one side to the other. In a farther corner, as she always did, Maria sat carefully on a piece of cement, protecting the lunchbox with her body as she gently unzipped it. Inside, there was the usual, a bread with egg, wrapped in a clean napkin, made with care by his mother in the early hours of the morning. Maria did not care what she brought to eat. She knew the effort involved in that little snack, and each bite was a reminder that, even with little, she had a lot of love at home. But that day, the silence around her was unexpectedly broken. On the other side of the courtyard, Amanda watched everything with a bored look, surrounded by her usual colleagues. She seemed to be looking for something or someone that would distract her, and when his eyes rested on Maria, isolated and oblivious to any attempt to fit in, he saw an opportunity there. Without measuring consequences, she raised her voice, attracting the attention of the group around her and pointing to the humble girl's snack. The words he said were full of contempt, and it was not long before the laughter spread like fire in dry straw. The entire courtyard turned around. Curious, amused looks, some embarrassed. Maria froze. The bite of the bread was suspended in the air, and her eyes watered without her being able to help it. His heart raced in a painful rhythm, and the shame rose like a tidal wave, swallowing up any trace of courage. She tried to swallow hard, pretend nothing was happening, but the laughter weighed too much. The mockery came not only from Amanda, but from many who, in order to feel included, repeated the mockery. The snack, once a symbol of affection and effort, was now a laughing stock, and in the midst of all that cruel exposure, Maria felt smaller than ever. Not knowing where to hide, he stood up with trembling hands, leaving his bread and lunchbox behind. Her eyes were cloudy, and the only thing she could do was walk quickly away, trying to find some refuge where she could collapse without being seen. The school, which until then had been a place where hope clung to, at that moment was transformed into a scene of pain. Every step seemed to weigh tons, and every laugh that echoed behind her was like a new wound being opened. His chest tightened, and the question that swirled in his mind was only one: why? Meanwhile, Amanda savored the attention. Her colleagues applauded her, laughed together, repeated the comments with even more cruelty. It was as if ridiculing someone more fragile gave her a dose of renewed power. And that was what she sought, to feed her superiority with the pain of others. Not for a second did he reflect on what he had done, that, for her, was just another joke, another funny scene in the midst of the monotony of school days. But for Maria, that public humiliation would be a profound mark. In the days that followed, the mood changed. Maria began to walk through the corridors with her head down, try to avoid any eye contact. He sat at the back of the room, his shoulders shrugged, hoping that no one would remember his existence. The snack, which was previously consumed calmly and gratefully, was now left aside or hidden. Eating became a tense moment, full of surveillance, as if at any moment another wave of humiliation could come, and that, little by little, began to turn off the light that Mary carried in her eyes. The school, which was already an unequal space, became increasingly hostile. Amanda's attitude had given a kind of endorsement for others to repeat the same behavior. All it took was a simple backpack, a worn-out shoe, a modest snack, and soon poisonous comments would appear. The environment was contaminated with a kind of silent but constant cruelty. The weakest began to walk like shadows, while most popular, feeling unpunished, fed a cycle of exclusion and derision. Maria, despite being injured, tried to move on. The mother could see her daughter's sad look, the long silences, the sudden discouragement. But Maria said nothing. I preferred to swallow the pain, hide the tears, pretend that everything was fine. She knew that her mother already had too many problems, and she didn't want to add another weight to her hard routine. But inside, he struggled not to fall apart. Amanda's gesture had crossed the line of mockery. It was an invisible but profound aggression that undermined their self-esteem and increased the feeling of not belonging. Meanwhile, Amanda continued to reign at the top of the school's social pyramid. His life seemed intact. She kept arriving in luxurious cars, wearing expensive clothes, surrounded by sycophants. He seemed untouchable, invincible. Nothing indicated that this castle built on appearance and arrogance was about to collapse. She didn't even remember the scene in the courtyard, because for those who have never felt pain, the pain of others is easily erased. But the universe has its peculiar way of acting, and when everything seems too stable, that's when the earthquake comes. While Maria learned by force to deal with injustice and cruelty, something was already moving behind the scenes of Amanda's life. A light, almost imperceptible wind began to blow, bringing changes that she had not yet imagined. And soon, the roles would be reversed in a way that was as brutal as it was unexpected. That world where everything seemed immutable would begin to dismantle before the eyes of those who believed that nothing could go wrong. The truth often comes when you least expect it, and when it does, it exposes everything that was hidden beneath the surface of luxury and power. It was just the beginning of a profound transformation. Time, relentless and fair, was already setting the stage for the next act of this story. The gate of the house creaked as Maria pushed it with effort. Her hunched shoulders, slow steps, and blank gaze betrayed a sadness that no child should carry. The sun was already beginning to hide on the horizon, tinting the sky with orange tones that contrasted with the weight she carried within herself. Each step towards the small balcony seemed to require more strength than the thin body was able to bear. But despite the emotional fatigue, she knew that there, in that simple home with peeling walls and the smell of freshly made food, she would find the only place where the world didn't hurt her. As soon as she entered, she was greeted by the familiar aroma of beans boiling on the stove and by the warm hands of her mother, who immediately noticed her daughter's different silence. No questions were needed. An exchange of glances was enough for everything to be understood. The mother, a soft-spoken woman with a firm gaze, did not rush to console with empty words. Instead, it just welcomed it. He let Maria feel the weight of her own feelings, but at the same time, he made her remember with gestures that she was not alone. Sitting side by side in the kitchen, between the noise of the wooden spoon stirring the broth and the steam rising from the pot, the mother shared something more valuable than any advice: her own story. He spoke of how, in his youth, he had also been the target of laughter and contempt because of poverty. She told of the patched clothes, the shoes inherited from her older brothers, the simple snack that many mocked, and how it all shaped who she was. The words did not come with anger, but with a surprising serenity. There was a wisdom that was born of pain transformed into strength, and this strength, little by little, was transferred to Mary, as if it were passed from mother to daughter through breathing, touching, and listening. Maria, still teary-eyed, began to see it all in a different way. For the first time, he understood that bread and egg, the target of so much ridicule, was not a sign of shame, but of resistance. Every hastily packed snack before school, every hand-sewn piece of clothing, every simple gesture of care was a way for his mother to say, "You matter." And this, in the face of all the cruelty he had endured that day, began to weigh more than the laughter and jeers. Because, deep down, there was a difference between what is transient and what is permanent. The opinion of others changed with the wind. Her mother's love was unwavering. That night, Mary slept embracing this truth. There was still pain, there were still marks, but there was also a new flame lit inside his chest. Something that said that she was not defined by what she had or did not have, nor by the comments of those who did not know her story. This awareness did not come as a sudden snap, but as a soft light that gradually gained strength. It was as if, without even realizing it, she began to build within herself a shield made of dignity, a shield that did not prevent sadness, but prevented sadness from completely dominating it. In the following days, Maria returned to school with firmer steps, not because everything had been resolved, but because she now carried something that Amanda and the others could never understand. The silent conviction that her essence was stronger than appearance. The snack was still the same. The uniform was still shabby. But inside her, something had changed forever. There was no shame anymore, only awareness. The awareness that it was not the snack that should cause astonishment, but the behavior of those who needed to demean others to feel better. Curiously, this new posture did not go unnoticed. Some colleagues, accustomed to seeing Maria cowering, now looked at her with a hint of strangeness. It was as if that girl who had previously occupied the most invisible space in the room was beginning to glow, even without wanting to. And this shine, discreet but firm, had nothing to do with popularity or new clothes. It had to do with the look, with the way she raised her eyes to the world, as if to say, "You don't define me." The mother, in turn, continued to be the foundation. In every conversation at the end of the day, in every meal shared, in every piece of advice given between assignments, she cultivated the sense of value in her daughter. There was no hurry. There was no charge. There was only a constant and loving presence, which reaffirmed day after day that life, no matter how hard, could be faced with courage and truth. And it was exactly the solid foundation that gave Maria the necessary balance to withstand the cross glances and whispers in the corridors. The school, even hostile, was unable to erase what was cultivated at home. In fact, it was precisely because of the oppressive environment that Mary's strength began to take shape, like a flower that grows on the asphalt. It rose slowly, contrary to all statistics and expectations, not to prove anything to anyone, but to honor what she had learned from the woman who had raised her with so much effort. Humility, which had once seemed like a burden, was now his greatest virtue, a symbol of pride, because it was she who sustained her identity. She was the one who kept it whole, even in the midst of contempt. Meanwhile, Amanda continued to live in the world of appearances, but, although still surrounded by empty praise and faithful followers, she began to perceive a growing restlessness, something she couldn't name, but that bothered her in silence. Perhaps it was the way Maria began to walk, how she faced situations, how she seemed to grow in dignity, even surrounded by scarcity. Amanda wouldn't admit it, but that behavior disturbed her. It was as if Maria, even though she was but a joke, had something that she herself could not achieve. This discomfort was subtle, but real, and little by little, it infiltrated the moments when Amanda was alone. The laughter of his friends no longer filled as much as before. The likes, the comments, the admiring looks lost strength when there was no one around. And in this void that arose between one post and another, Amanda began to question things she had never thought of before. She questioned not only Maria, but herself. The security he had displayed so much, little by little, showed signs of cracking. Something was changing, not in the external world, but within it. Meanwhile, Maria continued to follow, with discreet but firm steps, with wounds that were still healing, but with an increasingly resistant spirit. The school had not changed. The difficulties continued, but now she knew that even in the worst of circumstances, there was something that no one could take away from her, what she learned at home, the value of respect, the beauty of simplicity, the courage to remain who you are, even when everything around you tries to convince you otherwise. And it was this strength, cultivated in the silence of the nightly conversations, the impromptu lunches and the life lessons whispered between one task and another, that made Maria move forward, not out of pride, but out of conviction, because now she understood, more clearly than ever, that the values she carried within her were more precious than any appearance she could boast. And this truth, so simple and so powerful, began to resonate with a force that went beyond the walls of that school. The impact was immediate. Amanda woke up one day in her bed of Egyptian sheets, and the next she was surrounded by cardboard boxes, collecting the few belongings she had left. The jewelry, the designer dresses, the imported shoes, everything was left behind, carried away by trucks that did not distinguish sentimental value from monetary value. The silence of the house, now empty, seemed more deafening than any scandal. It was a sound of collapse, of falling without warning, of ruin that does not knock at the door. It just enters. The news tirelessly hammered out the details of the case. Millionaire embezzlements, overpriced contracts, bribes recorded in spreadsheets with coded names. And there, between figures and accusations, Amanda's last name became synonymous with shame. Social networks, where she once boasted trips, parties, and expensive gifts, now became court. Cruel memes, scathing comments, and a barrage of offensive messages flooded everything. There was nowhere she could hide. At school, The corridors that once opened his passage now became narrow tunnels, where whispers and glances pierced the skin like blades. But this was short-lived. The dismissal notification came dry and impersonal, as if it were just resolving a formality. Without the payment of tuition, Amanda was no longer part of that universe. She lost not only formal education, but the false pedestal where she believed she was established. What hurt the most, however, was not the loss of the assets. It was the sudden absence of those whom, until then, he had called friends. The messages ceased. The invitations evaporated. Loyalty, which once seemed solid, has turned out to be a fragile construct made up of interests. People who knocked on her door to enjoy parties and dinners now pretended not to see her on the street. The contempt was as evident as the glow that once surrounded her, only now it was an inverted, harsh glow that repelled rather than attracted. His mother, who had previously been used to directing orders to employees, now tried to organize her life with her own hands. Amanda watched her trying to cook simple dishes, taking care of the cleaning, arguing with lawyers, and trying to protect the little that was left. The haughty and controlling figure unraveled, revealing someone fragile, confused and disoriented in the face of the weight of public shame. The father, in turn, was now just a haggard face stamped on television screens, being carried from one side to the other with handcuffs on his wrists. The patriarch who dictated rules in the mansion was now just another defendant awaiting trial. Amanda, not knowing where to go or how to rebuild something among the rubble of life she never learned to question, began walking the streets with a strange sense of invisibility. For the first time, no one recognized her, or, worse, they pretended not to. The shop windows no longer called her by name. The automatic doors seemed to open with less enthusiasm. It was as if the world had also uninstalled her from what had previously seemed to be her natural habitat. When she returned to the new place where her family had settled, a small apartment borrowed by a distant uncle, Amanda looked around and found nothing that reminded her of that previous life. The decor was simple, the furniture antique, and the rooms cramped. There was no room service, no hot tubs, no gold-framed mirrors. There was only silence, dust, and an insistent musty smell that didn't go out no matter how much the windows were open all day. However, something even stranger began to form inside her, a discomfort that did not come from poverty, but from lack of direction. For the first time, she felt the weight of not having learned to live without depending on masks, without supporting her identity in what she had. I didn't know how to cook. I didn't know how to take a bus. I didn't know how much bread cost. His fingers trembled at the touch of hard cash, as if he had become hostile matter. Everything seemed distant, incomprehensible. Real life was a language she never had to learn to speak. As the days passed, the pain of losing luxury gave way to the anguish of not knowing who it was. The expensive clothes were left behind, but the emptiness they hid was still present. The absence of likes and virtual validation revealed a vulnerability that even she herself did not know existed. And, between one night and another without sleep, she began to realize that she never learned to see herself in the mirror without filters, without makeup, without forced compliments. In the midst of this emotional chaos, the image of Mary came back to his mind. Not that Maria who was the target of laughter and cruel comments, but the girl who, even wounded, walked with her head held high. Amanda, who had previously laughed at her along with the others, now began to see something different in that silent posture. It was as if there was an invisible fortress supporting Mary, something that no expensive outfit could offer, something that resisted even in the face of mockery and exclusion. This perception, still embryonic, began to bother Amanda. For the first time, she wondered how anyone could withstand so much pressure without falling apart. While she herself collapsed before the judgmental gaze of the people, Maria seemed to have gone through even more difficult situations with serenity that now made sense. Perhaps because Maria always knew where she stepped. Perhaps because, unlike her, Maria had not built her identity on a fragile foundation of appearances. The thought of having laughed at someone's pain now weighed on Amanda with unrelenting force. She remembered the comments she made, the laughter she gave, the way she pushed Maria away from everyone. And now, ironically, she was the one who lived isolated, rejected, despised. The role reversal was not just a punishment, but a kind of cruel mirror reflecting what she had become, or, worse, what she had always been, without realizing it. It was inevitable that this internal process would begin to generate a transformation, albeit a silent one. Pride was replaced by a growing discomfort. Arrogance gave way to a longer look at the people around him. And little by little, Amanda began to listen more than she spoke, to observe more than she posted, to feel more than she pretended. That sudden fall stripped her not only of her possessions, but also of the emotional armor that had always protected her from reality. There was now an opening, a crack through which something new could enter, but it was still early. The wound was exposed, and everything still hurt. Nothing was rebuilt overnight, and Amanda began to understand that starting over would require more than strength. It would require humility. The same humility that she had so often despised now showed itself as the only way out. And even though I didn't know where to start, I felt like I couldn't run away from that truth anymore. The city kept turning, indifferent to his pain. Cars passed by, traffic lights changed color. Pedestrians went on their hurried paths. And she, standing in the middle of the chaos, was no longer the same. The world around her seemed the same as always. But inside her, something was finally beginning to break. And it is precisely at this point, where the fall reveals not the end, but the possibility of rebirth, that history begins to take a new direction. The first few days were the hardest. Amanda, accustomed to luxury hotel beds and designer clothes, now found herself forced to sleep on the icy concrete of the sidewalks, her body squeezed into a piece of cardboard that barely protected her from the biting night wind. His mother, still trying to maintain some shred of dignity, was by his side, but the two found themselves completely lost, not knowing how to move on. What once seemed like a perfect life was now disintegrating before their eyes, and all that remained was a harsh, unforgiving reality of the streets. The smell of dirt and the incessant noise of traffic were constant, but nothing compared to the emptiness that Amanda felt inside her. The fear of vulnerability engulfed her, and the shame of her situation made her not look anyone in the eye. Each step on the streets brought the memory of what he had lost, and with it, the feeling of no longer having a place in the world. If before she was someone admired, someone who inspired envy, now she was just a shadow of herself, without any value in the eyes of society. Hunger, which was once something distant, now consumed her from the inside out. Her stomach hurt all the time, not for lack of food, but for the anguish of not knowing when she would have the next piece of bread. His mother, though tired, still stood strong. She had lived through moments of adversity in the past and knew how to stand up, but Amanda didn't have that same resilience. She, who had never had to fight for anything, was now faced with the crude reality of survival. Food, once an overconsumed luxury, now seemed like an unattainable commodity, a treasure lost on the streets of the city. The nights were even more difficult. The cold of the early morning seeped under the thin clothes he was still wearing, and despite all the effort to protect himself, the discomfort was overwhelming. What once seemed to be a momentary need, something temporary, now stretched on endlessly, and what hurt the most, more than an empty stomach or a body shivering with cold, was a feeling of being invisible, of being nothing in the face of a city that followed its routine indifferent to its pain. The pride, which had once sustained her, now turned into a heavy burden. I couldn't ask for help. I couldn't accept the look of pity from others. People passed by her as if she were invisible, and the few who tried to help were turned away by a silent but fierce rejection. Amanda still clung to a remnant of her old identity, the one that was built on the idea of independence and superiority. But deep down, she knew there was no way to maintain that facade when everything around her crumbled. The reality was different. She needed help, but she couldn't admit it even to herself. Loneliness, which was once just a distant feeling, now manifested itself in a cruel way. There was no more company. There were no more friends. The phone, once flooded with messages and calls, was now silent, with the screen always empty. Social rejection was more painful than any physical cut, and Amanda felt abandoned by everyone around her. The emptiness of his new life was not only material, but emotional. She experienced for the first time the weight of exclusion, the pain of being ignored. Loneliness was also present in conversations with her mother. As they tried to find a shelter for the night, They exchanged few words. There was no more room for dialogues full of promises for the future. The future, now, seemed like a distant place, where expectations no longer existed. The mother, while still maintaining her dignity, was also broken. She knew she had nothing more to offer her daughter than love and courage, but the fear of tomorrow was already present in her eyes. Amanda, her face dirty with tears and dust, looked at the people who passed in front of her, not understanding how it all happened. The windows of the luxury stores that once made her feel superior now seemed to mock her misery. What she saw reflected in the windows was no longer a brightened image, but a broken, undone image, a version of herself that she barely recognized. The few times she looked at her mother's face, she felt a mixture of guilt and helplessness. What could he do to reverse all that? How could he save his mother from such a cruel fate? The idea of rescuing what they had lost seemed impossible, but something inside her still insisted that she should try, that there was still a way out. But the truth was, she didn't know how. The weight of guilt consumed her, as if she were responsible for all that. However, even in the face of so much pain, there was something that began to germinate within Amanda. Maybe it was a simple need to survive. Maybe it was a human instinct that made her cling to the last spark of hope. She remembered her mother's words, everything she had always said about never giving up. The mother always believed that, no matter how difficult the situation was, there would always be a way to overcome it. Maybe this was the moment for Amanda to finally understand what this really meant. The struggle for survival was not only physical, but also emotional and mental. She would have to find strength within herself, even if it seemed impossible. But the streets were still unforgiving, and Amanda didn't know how to make the first move. What hurt the most was not the fact that he was on the street, but the fact that he realized that perhaps he no longer had control over his own life. The path ahead seemed hazy, like a maze with no way out, but there was a part of Amanda that refused to believe it was the end. Something inside her began to struggle, a silent desire to find a way to get out of there, to rebuild something, anything. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't stay there any longer. Meanwhile, her mother followed, as always, ahead of her, with the same silent strength that had always accompanied her, but with her shoulders a little more hunched, her face more aged from the daily struggle. Amanda began to realize that, despite everything, her mother still carried a flame of resistance. It was the only thing left of his old life. And maybe that's what she needed. A little of the strength her mother still had to stand up, a little of the courage she'd always shown, even when the world seemed to conspire against them. Amanda closed her eyes, feeling the icy wind hit her face, and realized she wasn't alone. Not really. Something was still there, an invisible force, something she would need to learn to recognize and use, not to survive, but to start over. And perhaps in this new beginning, it would be possible to find what she had lost sight of, dignity, hope, and, who knows, even the ability to believe in herself again. The biting wind caused Amanda to cower even more in her shabby coat. She had no strength to stand up, nor to fight the reality of her new world. The lost gaze, now tired and lackluster, was fixed on the busy street in front of him. Cars passed by, people in a hurry, without noticing her presence there on the margin. Her stomach, empty for hours, hurt constantly, but Amanda no longer cared. She felt irrelevant, a shadow of the woman she had once been. The dirty sidewalks and the incessant noise of the city swallowed her up little by little, and what was left was a sense that everything that had once been important was now nothing more than a distant memory. It was then that, among the chaos of the street, his eyes were fixed on something familiar. Two figures were slowly walking towards him. It was Maria, the old schoolmate, and her mother, that simple woman, but always with a welcoming smile. They carried plastic bags, and from inside them came small wrapped packages, probably lunchboxes. What seemed to be an ordinary scene, almost unnoticed by everyone around, was like a beacon for Amanda, a reflection of what she had lost. Maria and her mother were there, distributing food to the homeless, and Amanda, sitting on the sidewalk, was overcome by a mixture of shame and sadness. That was the same Maria who, at school, was always the target of contemptuous looks. The same Maria who never had what the other girls had, but who always showed a sincere generosity and humility that Amanda, immersed in her world of luxury, had never been able to recognize. Now, the scene was different. It was Amanda who saw herself in the position of the one who needed help, and Maria, with her mother, was the one who offered what she could, although she knew that what they had was little. The irony was painful. While Amanda had lived a life of excess, Maria lived with a minimum, but still did what she could to help others. The difference between the two, which had seemed so great before, now became more and more tenuous. As Maria approached, Amanda's eyes met those of her former colleague. For an instant, the world around him disappeared. It was as if time had stopped, and all the memories of the past, the empty conversations in the schoolyard, the laughter, the moments of arrogance, all came back like a movie in high definition. She saw Mary, her eyes full of compassion, and a flash of the past hit her like a shockwave. Those two girls, who had once distanced themselves due to class differences, were now there on the same street, with the same look of understanding. The contempt that Amanda had always had for Maria seemed to dissolve, and the only thing left was a confrontation with her own reality. Maria, without hesitation, stretched out her hands with the lunchbox she had prepared. Amanda, at first, tried to refuse, but something inside her prevented her from pushing the gesture away. The pain of hunger was immense, but even more immense was the feeling of humiliation that took over her. Maria's gaze, free of judgment, made Amanda realize that there was no more room for pride. There was no longer any place to keep up appearances. There, at that moment, the real Amanda, without the adornments of the past, was naked not only physically, but emotionally. She found herself for the first time without the defenses that luxury and vanity provided her. I can't accept that, Amanda said, her voice low, barely audible, but Maria didn't seem to be offended. She just smiled, a calm and unhurried smile, as if she understood everything that was going on in the other's mind. Sometimes what we need most is not what we can afford, but what we can share, Maria replied with a calmness that touched the bottom of Amanda's heart. Those words, simple and true, resonated deep within her, like an echo of what she had become. Maria had nothing more than Amanda, but she still possessed something that the other had lost, the ability to look at the other and feel empathy, something that Amanda's life, full of self-centeredness and ostentation, did not allow her to perceive. Amanda looked at her mother, who was sitting next to her, her eyes empty with silent pain. The gesture of Mary and her mother was not just a simple act of kindness. It was a reflection of what they stood for, the opposite of what Amanda and her mother had become. As she looked at those two humble women, Amanda realized that even in the midst of so much poverty, there was still something more precious than what she had lost. What Mary and her mother had was not wealth, but something much rarer, humanity. With a deep sigh, Amanda reached out and grabbed the lunchbox, not out of necessity, but out of something deeper, more urgent. She didn't know what she felt at that moment, but something inside her said that Maria's gesture would mark her life forever. It wasn't just about food or the material help they were offering. It was about something that couldn't be bought, something she could only find within herself. The ability to start over, to break free from the invisible chains of her past and start a new journey. Maria, with a smile still gentle, said nothing more. She just looked at Amanda with understanding, as if she knew that this moment was the beginning of something that Amanda still couldn't fully understand, but that she knew would start to be part of her life in a way she never imagined. The past, with all its errors and vices, now seemed distant, like a chapter that had come to an end. The feeling of being someone important, of having a place in the world, would no longer come from material possessions, but from the ability to open oneself to others, to understand that true wealth was in human connection and not in the accumulation of goods. Amanda stood up, still feeling the weight of everything she had lost, but at the same time with a new lightness, a feeling that she could take the first step toward something different. She looked at her mother, who was still silent, but who now seemed more serene. The two were, somehow, more connected, more aware that life would go down other paths. The pain was still there, but no longer as an unbearable weight. She knew that the first step was to look reality in the face and not try to hide behind what had been. The transformation would not come overnight, but that meeting with Maria and her mother marked the beginning of a profound change, something that Amanda, little by little, would begin to understand. What happened that Saturday was much more than a simple meeting. It was a moment when Amanda began to realize that the true transformation, the true strength, was in the ability to rebuild herself and to finally understand what it really meant to be rich. Amanda looked at the lunchbox in her hands, but the weight she felt didn't come from the simple food that was there. So simple, but at the same time so loaded with meaning. She watched the plate with teary eyes, her stomach empty, but her soul filled with a whirlwind of emotions she didn't know how to process. Mary's gesture was not just a physical action of offering food. It was a silent lesson in humanity. The girl who had once been despised, ignored, was now reaching out to Amanda without any shadow of judgment, without traces of spite, without traces of the pain that, surely, life had imposed on both of them. What Amanda felt at that moment was something she would never have imagined experiencing. She was so used to appearances, to the idea that everything could be controlled and kept within a comfortable standard, that she never imagined that a simple gesture of kindness could go so deep. Maria didn't say a word, but the delivery of the lunchbox, so simple and direct, was like a silent invitation for Amanda to put aside the pride that had sustained her for so long, the pride she carried in every step she took in her old life. Mary did not need to speak, for her attitude spoke more than 1,000 words could. Forgiveness was not in his words, but in action, in the act of approaching, caring, connecting without demanding anything in return. Amanda felt the weight of her own arrogance slip down her eyes, which were now full of tears. The tears were not just of pain, but of a deep realization, an acknowledgement of how much she had lost herself along the way. The life she led, of ostentation and superficial perfection, had gradually erased everything that really mattered. She didn't know how or why, but there, with that simple gesture, Maria was speechless, giving Amanda back something she didn't even know she had lost, the ability to see the other, to connect, to forgive herself and, who knows, others too. There was no shame in accepting that help, despite everything Amanda thought about herself. There was not the slightest trace of the idea that she was being weak in receiving. It was as if, at that moment, what was most important was simply to make room for humility to take the place of haughtiness, so that gratitude was present in the heart that, until then, only knew how to nourish pride and ego. The pride of those who thought that everything could be conquered by their own strength, of those who believed that life was made of victories and personal achievements. And now, there she was, sitting on the sidewalk, with a simple meal in her hands, realizing that true strength was in the ability to surrender, to allow herself to be cared for, to recognize that she was no longer the woman she had been. It had been broken, not by external forces, but by the need to look at itself and see the vulnerability that had always been present. Maria, with her simplicity, had broken the barriers of a distant past. She didn't need to take revenge. She didn't need to return the pain that Amanda, in a way, once caused. Mary's forgiveness was in the little things, in the willingness to reach out, in the lack of judgment, in the absence of any kind of charge. Amanda had often distanced herself from people like Maria. She, with her closed world full of armor, never bothered to look beyond the surface, to realize what was behind the facade of those who seemed to have less than her. Now, the lesson was there in front of her in the serene and silent gaze of Mary. Amanda brought the lunch box to her lips, feeling the hot food as an immediate relief, but also feeling something even deeper. It was as if that gesture had touched a part of her soul that she didn't even know existed. She chewed with the feeling that, when she physically fed, something was feeding inside her as well. Mary had been the instrument of forgiveness that came not from words, but from a genuine and silent act. A forgiveness that didn't require Amanda to apologize, that didn't ask for explanations. It was a forgiveness free of conditions, of demands, something that only someone who had already felt the weight of humiliation could understand and offer in such a pure way. Mary knew what it was like to be humiliated, what it was like to be seen as inferior. She was not ignorant of the pain that Amanda felt. But, on the contrary, it was precisely because she knew this pain that she was able to reach out without an ounce of resentment. She understood that sometimes life brings with it a series of lessons that we can only learn when we hit rock bottom. And rock bottom, at that moment, was not a physical condition, but an emotional one. Maria knew that true change would only occur when Amanda was ready to abandon the masks and defenses that, until that moment, had protected her from the world, but also prevented her from being who she really was. Amanda looked at Maria with gratitude, but also with a mixture of incredulity. How was it possible that she had so much to offer, even after all that she had been through? How could Mary have such a pure soul free of resentment, while she, with all that she possessed, felt empty and lost? What was it that Mary had, which she seemed so far from achieving? She knew there was no easy answer to these questions. But one thing was certain. Maria's silent forgiveness had begun to break down the walls Amanda had built over the years. When Amanda finished eating, she felt a calmness she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was not a superficial calm, but a peace that came from within. Something was changing inside her, something that even she didn't fully understand. The shame that once accompanied it was now beginning to dissipate, as if it were replaced by the understanding that life experiences, good or bad, are what make us up. And at that moment, she was no longer the woman who cared only about what others thought of her. She was, in some ways, more than that. She was starting to see herself with different eyes that could finally see through the pain of others and recognize that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is simply allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. She looked once more at Maria, who was now talking to her mother, unhurriedly, without any sign that there was anything to settle. It was a moment of simple presence, and for the first time in a long time, Amanda felt that the simple act of being there, at that very moment with these two women, was all she needed. She knew that the road ahead would still be long and difficult. But something inside her said that forgiveness, humility, and gratitude were now open to her in a way she never imagined possible. The pride that had always defined her now seemed small, almost irrelevant in the face of what was beginning to blossom in her heart. As the two women continued their walk, Amanda sat there, soaking up the silence, absorbing the lesson. She knew that that meeting, that simple act of kindness, would mark her life forever. The transformation was just beginning. Amanda began to realize that something had changed inside her, something profound that she couldn't explain with words. In the days following that meeting, a new perspective was forming, with the lessons of humility and empathy echoing in his mind. She found herself reflecting on how it had all happened so fast, but in such a transformative way. What once seemed to be just an exchange of glances and a simple gesture of kindness now revealed itself as the beginning of a process of reconciliation with herself and the world around her. The slump she had experienced was not just financial or social. It was a fall that made her touch the bottom, but also made her understand the fragility of life. Before, Amanda was someone used to seeing the world through a lens of superiority, thinking that her position, her possessions, and her image were all she needed to feel safe. But life, with its ability to turn the tables, showed him that all of this could be taken away from one moment to the next. And when that happens, what's left? What really matters when the trappings of ego and the barriers of vanity fall? It was this question that began to germinate in Amanda's mind, making her rethink her own behavior, her relationships, and even her own values. Maria and her mother, in all their simplicity, had welcomed her in a way that Amanda did not imagine possible. They didn't need grand gestures or elaborate words. What really touched Amanda was the sincerity with which they were treated. There was no trace of piety, not a shred of judgment. What existed between them was something genuine, something that was not forced, but that came naturally. Amanda felt it in the flesh. With them, she felt welcome not for what she had, but for what she was. Maria and her mother were not interested in her story of success or failure, but in her humanity, which, as much as she tried to hide for so long, was still there. This experience of welcoming made her understand that true wealth is not in possessions, but in the ability to give and receive with an open heart. Amanda knew that as much as she had been educated to value competition, and having more than the other, that mentality was limited. True joy came not from the material things she possessed, but from the feeling of being part of something bigger, of being seen and accepted, not for her achievements, but for her essence. In this new world, the social differences that had previously separated her from Mary have disappeared, as if they had never existed. The two girls now lived in a completely new context, where appearances no longer mattered. The barriers that had been built by society, by external expectations, by the rules of a world that valued status more than character, dissipated. What had become valuable, in fact, was the generosity that each of them could offer to the other. The conversations became more genuine, without the pressures of who owed more or who had more. The mere fact of being together was already a gift. Amanda felt that by sharing moments with Maria and her mother, she was not only learning to give, but also to receive in a pure way, without the burden of demand. She began to understand that it was not necessary to compete for space, attention, or recognition. In the new world in which she was immersed, what mattered was shared humanity, respect, and a willingness to help without expecting anything in return. Each meeting, each smile, each exchange of words with Maria and her mother, for Amanda, represented a new way of looking at the world. She, who previously saw life as a race in which everyone needed to get ahead, now began to understand that true victory was in being able to give without expecting anything in return, to support those in need without worrying about reciprocity. What she discovered quietly and powerfully was that generosity is not an exchange of favors, but a force that binds people together in an unbreakable way. And as she experienced this, Amanda realized that not only what she was learning, but also what she was earning, was infinitely more valuable than anything she had ever had. At first, Amanda still struggled with the echoes of the past. She couldn't help but wonder what the people she had left behind would think of her new stance. Old Amanda, who prided herself on her status, wealth, and prestige, was bothered by the idea of being seen as less important people. But over time, she came to understand that these worries were empty. What really mattered now was the inner peace she was beginning to feel, the lightness that came with being honest with herself. The pressure to keep up appearances began to dissipate, and she felt that she could finally breathe easier. When I looked at Maria, I no longer saw the girl she laughed in the past, but a person just like her, with her own challenges, with her own scars. And it made her feel a real connection, a connection she had never experienced with the people in her old circle. As the days passed, Amanda gradually detached herself from the expectations she had learned to value. The world of yesterday, the one that judged her by the etiquette she wore, the house she lived in, the trips she took, no longer made sense. She now felt that friendships based on superficiality and status were too fragile to sustain her. The true connection, the one that touched the depths of the soul, was within everyone's reach. It was a simple, unpretentious, but deeply meaningful connection. Maria and her mother, with their simple and generous lives, showed Amanda that true luxury is not in possessing, but in being able to offer something sincere to those around her. They had become a mirror to her, reflecting what she had lost, but also showing her what she could be. On a quiet afternoon, sitting in a square with Maria and her mother, Amanda felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of belonging. There was no longer any distinction between them. They were equal, not by appearance or what they possessed, but by the human connection that united them. Amanda, once so obsessed with maintaining control over her image and status, now felt a peace she had never known. She knew that while she still had a lot to learn, that new phase of her life was just beginning. She no longer needed to be someone she wasn't. Now, she could be who she really wanted to be. Someone willing to give without reservation, to love without conditions, to live without the weight of being perfect. The lesson of humility, empathy, and generosity from Maria and her mother had planted a deep seed in Amanda's heart. And she knew that, from that moment on, the rest of her life would be different. What Amanda did not know, as she began to find herself again, was that that new path that opened up before her was not just a trajectory of personal reconstruction, but a true internal revolution. The change didn't happen overnight, but she felt more and more that she was diving into something deep, something that touched her deep soul. When she began to help Maria and her mother in social actions, a new world unfolded before her eyes. The simple act of preparing lunch boxes and distributing them to those who needed them most was more than physical work. It was a process of healing, learning, and, above all, connection. She no longer saw herself as a person with control over everything, but as someone who, in some way, could make a difference in the life of others. These were not big gestures, but small daily actions that could transform lives. And Amanda began to realize that by helping, she was also helping herself. Those afternoons of volunteer work with Maria and her mother became moments of reflection, of self-discovery. Each lunch box she prepared and distributed carried something more than just food. She was offering a part of herself, without selfishness or expectations. For the first time, Amanda felt like she was indulging in something bigger than her own pains and insecurities. She clearly felt that she was rebuilding not only her life, but also her worldview, living with Maria, who before seemed like an ordinary, simple, and unimportant girl, now became a true source of learning. Mary did not need words to teach, for her actions spoke for themselves. The humility that Maria displayed in each gesture, the way she dedicated herself without ever expecting recognition, made Amanda question herself about everything she had valued until then. She had lived under the aegis of false perfection, incessantly seeking the approval of others, not realizing that what really mattered was the quality of relationships, sincerity in dealing with people, and true generosity. Over time, Amanda began to take even more decisive steps towards her transformation. The pain of having lost everything no longer consumed her in the same way. Instead of regretting what was left behind, she began to look with gratitude at the new opportunities that arose. Being able to return to school in a public school was one of the biggest milestones of this new journey. Going back to school was not only a matter of starting over, but also of regaining confidence in herself. When Amanda entered the classroom, the feeling she had was that she was opening the doors to a new universe, where there was no room for judgment or the weight of the past. Each class was an opportunity for growth, for learning, and she made the most of it. The old fears and insecurities were being left behind, while the desire to learn and grow took over her heart. Amanda knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, she felt safe in her own skin. He no longer had to hide his weaknesses or try to fit into a mold that was never his own. Amanda's true strength, she realized, was in her ability to start over, to reinvent herself based on the lessons that life had brought her. What once seemed like an irreparable fall now turned out to be a turning point, something that pushed her to be a truer version of herself. Living with Maria and her mother, which before seemed to be a simple friendship, now revealed itself as a lever for her own awakening. They not only welcomed her, but helped her to rediscover herself, to see that life does not have to be perfect to be full. As her journey continued, Amanda found herself increasingly free from the shackles of the past and the need for approval. What she was beginning to understand, clearly, was that the true purpose of life is not to succeed in the eyes of others, but to find a path that is genuine, authentic, and full of meaning. And this, for her, was revealing itself in the simple act of living in a more humane, more supportive, more connected way with the people around her. Amanda, once so focused on achieving an unrealistic ideal, now cared about the real impact she could have on the lives of others. Every smile shared with the people she helped, every word of encouragement, every simple gesture of care made her feel more connected to what she really wanted for her life. She no longer saw herself as someone lost, but as a person who, every day, was building her story from the inside out. The changes in Amanda began to echo around her. Those who knew her, who had previously seen her as a closed, distant, and competitive person, could now perceive the lightness in her gaze, the generosity in her attitudes. Maria and her mother, with their simplicity, became beacons of guidance for Amanda, and she began to look at them with a deep respect. Their friendship, which began in a somewhat unusual way, turned into one of the most precious relationships of his life. Together, they became living examples of overcoming and starting over, an inspiration for those who were going through similar difficulties. Amanda no longer saw herself as the woman of the past, the one who sought status, material possessions, and approval. She now saw herself as a person in constant transformation, someone who understood the true value of life and who was willing to fight to maintain her authenticity and her purpose. As the months passed, Amanda discovered that true freedom lay in being able to be herself, without external pressures, without comparisons or expectations from others. What mattered most was being true to your own feelings and acting on what you truly believed. She had learned that what society values superficially does not define who she is. The outside world could keep spinning with its demands and standards, but Amanda now knew that the true measure of success lay in living whole, generously, and humbly. That was what really fulfilled her, what made her feel at peace. And it was in this process of self-discovery that Amanda, little by little, began to understand that her story had not ended, but had begun. Every step she took now was one step closer to a brighter future, more honest with herself and others. The pain of the past had been the seed for her growth, and she no longer looked back with regret, but with gratitude. The new beginning she was now experiencing was not only a chance to rebuild her life, but an opportunity to show the world that true strength lies in reinventing yourself, in learning to fall, and most importantly, in learning to get up with dignity. Amanda and Maria's story is proof that, in the end, what really matters is not what we have, but who we are and how we connect with others. Time may take away everything we build with our hands, but what we cultivate in our hearts remains. True wealth is not in possessions or appearance, but in the way we dedicate ourselves to others, especially when they need it most. Maria, with her simplicity and generosity, showed Amanda that character, empathy, and humility are the greatest treasures we can carry throughout our lives. In a world increasingly focused on ego and appearances, this lesson is more valuable than ever. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment with the phrase, "True wealth is in character." I want to know what you think about it. And if you've ever experienced something that made you reflect on the values that really matter. If this content made sense to you, like the video, so the message reaches more people who need to hear it too. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take advantage now so you don't miss any videos like this. What we have most to offer here are stories of transformation and overcoming. Oh, and there's a video here on the side that tells a very similar story. Click on it and come with me to continue this journey of reflection. See you later.